Hi, my name is Erin Hartgraves, and this is my Technology and Manufacturing and Their Effects on China, the US, and South Africa presentation. So to start off, I'm going to talk about manufacturing in the US, and we have a Gini of 55,980, and that's in international dollars. And our manufacturing contributed 8% to the US economy, and every lost manufacturing job means the loss of around 2.3 other jobs in the US economy, and that's due to the fact that a factory isn't its own entity. There are suppliers and distributors, marketers, companies that outsource to that factory, or the factory outsources to that company. And when the factory goes out of business, all of those other companies that contribute to the factory lose that business, so they lose clients, and it just creates a ripple effect through industries. And about 9% of the US workforce is in manufacturing, and only 27% of that 9% is women, which is kind of crazy that there's that much of a gap between men and women in manufacturing. And there was a study done between foreign-owned factories and domestically owned factories, and it was found that foreign-owned companies, if they were able to undergo the costs of entering the US market, they could have outperformed domestically owned companies. And foreign owned companies are more productive, technology intensive, and paid higher wages. In the US, doesn't have to just compete globally, but that forces them to compete locally within themselves. So it just creates quite a conundrum. And we lost a lot of manufacturing due to environmental regulation, because if you have a company in the US and then we have all of these restrictions on how much you could dump per year, you wouldn't want to be in that area. If you could outsource to Mexico where you could dump as much as you want, then you're better off. Plus, there's cheaper labor down there. So there's labor costs, and also localized manufacturing, which is basically like if you were to develop a product in a certain area, you would also want the components that make up that product to be developed in that area in order to reduce transportation costs and export and import costs. And that's the whole reason why regional trading blocks help, but in a way they also don't, because they kind of melt borders. And in our case, with the NAFTA agreement, we opened up free trade between Mexico and Canada, and while that would have helped us, it also hurt us because companies were outsourcing cheap labor in Mexico, and they have looser regulations on the environment. So obviously that's the easier choice in terms of money and expenses. Now I'm going to move on to technology in the US, and we have technology everywhere. It's available at our fingertips every day, and we have 232.02 million cell phone users and 286.94 million internet users. And we also have a freedom of information, and we can search anything whenever we want, at literally whenever we want. It's insane. And personally, I've gone through 5 cell phones, 3 laptops. At home, we have 3 very large TVs. We have a home computer. I've had an iPad and 3 iPods, all in the span of about 10 years, which I'm sure isn't the case for most people, but that much technology for one person is kind of outrageous, and it's a little unbelievable. And now I'm going to move on to Chinese manufacturing, and they have a Gini of 57,860, and that's for Hong Kong, because that's where a lot of the manufacturing is done. And I'm going to bring up the Apple iPhone, because Apple is one of the largest US companies, and they manufacture most of their goods in China and in that East Asia area, and then they export it back to the US. And in 2007, the US exported 687 millions worth of iPhones from China. And I'm sure it's a lot more now, because Apple is a lot more popular and they have a lot more products. And it's pretty crazy. And China manufactures about 80% of the world's air conditioners, 70% of its mobile phones, and 60% of its shoes, which means that they just contribute to the world economy very greatly, and they have a very large labor force. So moving on to Chinese technology. And China is slowly getting online. They definitely have gotten a lot better since they used to be, due to the fact that things are more available. So we have internet users were tripled from 2001 to 2004 from 2.57 to 7.23%, and then as of 2013, 45% of the population uses the internet, and 1,333.64 million cell phone users as of 2017, and that's kind of crazy due to the fact that the iPhone wasn't even available until 2009, and it was manufactured in 2007 over there. So yes, they have a lot of technology, but it was delayed a few years. They didn't have it as quickly as we had it, and they also have a lot of restricted online access. So to talk about that, I'm going to talk about the Great Firewall of China and the fact that the government filters a lot of what the people see and search for. And not all of this online search engines are complicit with Chinese law. There are companies like Wikipedia that are blocked and will probably stay blocked until these laws are lifted because they believe in the freedom of information. And Google complies with Chinese law. There is a Chinese Google, but there's a lot of controversy over it because Google has a very free-thinking mentality. They have a very free-thinking culture, and people think that it's kind of hypocritical of them that they have this free-thinking culture and they're contributing to this restriction of information in China. So I also have a quote that's from one of my sources about how the government puts these laws to promote good and eliminate bad and just to encourage healthy development of the internet. And while this makes it seem like they have good intentions, they also block a lot of things like phrases that have the word communism in it or revolution or dictatorship, things that would be harmful to the Chinese government. And now I'm going to talk about South Africa, my last country, which I want to talk about their manufacturing because they're traditionally an agricultural state. They're seen as an agricultural state, especially because they're below the North-South line or the Brant line. And I don't think they would necessarily have to stay as an agricultural state. I think they could develop into manufacturing. They just need to introduce it gradually. You can't just introduce a system to people who don't interact with it very often, because not only could it be a shock, but they don't know how to use it. So if we were to introduce education with it, develop their literacy and skills, I think we would be able to develop more of a manufacturing state there. And we would also need to get better roads in order to transportate materials and people. And now I want to talk about the HIPAA water roller, which was designed in South Africa by Mvubu Projects. And I really like this product. I first learned about it in my Product Design 1 class when we were doing case studies, and basically it filters water in a jug as it's rolled from the source back to the village or wherever the person lives. And it holds a lot of water. Normally they would have to go maybe a couple times a day to go get water, and they'd have to walk very far. And this also, they'd have to carry it on their head, which increases cranial and spinal damage. So by pushing the water, not only are they filtering it, but it reduces spinal and cranial damage. Plus, once this product was introduced, men thought that going to get water was more of a masculine task because they had to push a lot more water. It was a lot heavier. So girls ended up going to school more often, and women started running businesses, and it just kind of flip-flopped the whole structure to the society. They had to, the women were staying behind and the men were going to get water. And I just think that's kind of interesting that a product was able to flip that cultural understanding between men and women. And there is one problem with it. It costs $80 to manufacture, and it's already being manufactured in a very cheap way. It's being rotationally molded, which is basically you put a mold with the material you want to use, and you slowly heat it and rotate it so that the material is evenly distributed around the mold, and so there's no deformities in it. And it's a very cheap way to manufacture something. It's gotten a lot better since it was first invented, and it's a lot easier than injection molding. And I think that they would be able to develop and manufacture it there themselves rather than outsourcing the manufacturing somewhere else, because the people that need the Hippo water roller can't afford it. It costs $80 to manufacture, and they have to rely completely on foreign aid. It's kind of an unrealistic expectation for these people to be able to have clean drinking water and then be expected to rely completely on other people for it. They should be able to raise enough funds to buy it themselves. So if we were able to manufacture it where the people need it, it would create jobs, and then eventually they'd be able to purchase one themselves without having to rely on other people. And about 30,000 of these have been introduced to communities, not just in South Africa, but in places that water is very scarce. And moving on to telecenters in rural Africa. And I thought this was the article I chose for my paper because I thought it was very interesting that they were trying to introduce this technology into a place that doesn't really interact with it very much or doesn't have a lot of experience with it. And basically the telecenter was supposed to print, where people were supposed to be able to print, send emails, and use the telephone. And it was supposed to be a self-sustaining business where if something broke, they'd be able to have enough funds to fix it. Except the printer broke almost immediately, so they didn't have the funds to repair it, and they didn't have the skill to repair it themselves. So people had to print at another facility, and that caused them to kind of lose business, which just created a kind of endless cycle of not being able to run properly. And the center was underutilized due to the fact of literacy, due to a lack of literacy skills and skills in the community with technology. So I think this project could have been pushed further if the employees were better trained, or if the community was better, if the community was given lessons on how to use the technology and how it would benefit them. So I think that they could have pushed it further. My conclusions. So the reason I wanted to talk about all of these different countries was they're kind of at different stages in terms of industrialization and the division of labor. And yes, some countries are more suited for agriculture, and some countries aren't yet a industrial state, but I think they have the potential to be. I think that if they were to slowly introduce the skills and the technology they needed to become industrialized, they would be able to succeed and join the developing world and actually be able to produce the products that help their community. And then there's the digital divide, which information isn't always limited because of the lack of development in a country. In terms of the US, we have an unlimited amount of technology and an unlimited amount of information. But in China, they have pretty much an unlimited amount of technology, but their information is very restricted. And in South Africa, they have a very restricted amount of technology and information. And I think we could really change things around in the development world if we were able to introduce things like telecenters and manufacturing in those countries. And that's it.